California's statehood in 1850 raised the question of a more reliable means of communication between the Golden State and the rest of the nation. No matter what method of travel one chose, by ship around Cape Horn, or across the Isthmus of Panama, or walking the Emigrant Trail, it was going to take a minimum of 4 months and involve significant risks. Almost as soon as the ink had dried on the Compromise of 1850, the idea of a Pacific Railroad began to gain traction in Congress. Now, there were two possible routes for such a railroad. The first, and most feasible, was a southern route that would cross Texas and New Mexico, skirt the Mexican border in what is today Arizona, and cross Southern California to the port of San Diego. The other possible contender would originate in either Chicago or St. Louis, follow the Platte River across the Nebraska Territory, proceed up over the Rocky Mountains, cross the plateau, and then bore through the Sierra Nevada, then down into Sacramento. The northern route roughly followed the Emigrant Trail to California. Now, the great advantage of the southern route was a lack of serious geographic obstacles. The terrain from West Texas across New Mexico and into California was as flat as a griddle, and this railroad then could be built with existing technology. The disadvantage to the southern route was that it ran very close to Mexico, which in the 1850s could be considered a hostile power, and the fact that Northerners were none too keen about building a railroad in an area of the country that threatened to secede about once every decade. The Northern route's great advantages were that it was obviously at a safe distance from Mexico. The Northern route could very easily tie into the vast majority of the nation's railroad network, and it would be a lot easier to sustain the crews working on the railroad in a more temperate environment. Now, the great disadvantage to the northern route was that in order to provide the railroad companies with the land grants they would need to build the railroad, the Nebraska Territory would have to be organized. That would require an act of Congress. The Nebraska Territory was north of the Missouri Compromise line of 3630 and therefore closed to slavery. There was no great incentive for Southern senators to sign on to any bill that would organize free territory and open its legal settlement. Now, Stephen Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois, had been relentless in his pursuit of a Pacific Railroad. Sometimes he lacked support for the bill. At other times, he simply ran out of time in the legislative session. In 1854, Douglas revived his Nebraska bill. He attempted to gain Southern support by trying to convince key Southern senators like David Atchison of Missouri that the establishment of slavery through the exercise of popular sovereignty was a possibility in the Nebraska Territory. Douglas argued that, since the Compromise of 1850, the principle of popular sovereignty as applied to the Mexican cession was now the law of the land and was equally valid in the Nebraska Territory. Douglas reasoned that the new law had superseded the Missouri Compromise and Southerners weren't buying it. The price of Southern support was an explicit repeal of the Missouri Compromise line. Douglas held out as long as he could, but in the end, his Nebraska bill magically became the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and it included an explicit repeal of the 3630 line, opening both territories to the possibility of slavery. As Douglas had predicted, the Kansas-Nebraska Act created a hell of a storm. It went far beyond that. It produced a tectonic shift in the nation's political landscape. First, Kansas-Nebraska proved to be the death of the Whig Party. The northern wing of the party was outraged, and the southern wing sided with their Democratic neighbors. Next, a new coalition party, the Republicans, emerged out of the ruins of the Whig Party and added in several anti-slavery and free soil parties. A third significant result was the rebirth of Abraham Lincoln's political career. After being sidelined for several years over his position on the Mexican War, Lincoln quickly emerged as the most effective spokesman for the anti-Nebraska men of Illinois, and was deemed the most suitable challenger to the Democrat Stephen Douglas. A fourth significant result of Kansas-Nebraska was that it gravely damaged the Democratic Party in the North. Thousands of conscious Democrats left the party and fused with the Republicans. Prior to the act, the Democratic Party had been pretty well split between northern and southern wings. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the party became dominated by the South. Now, prior to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the conflict over slavery, one could argue, was sort of simmering on the back burner. Stephen Douglas turned up the heat and caused the entire controversy to boil over. While giving an address attacking the Kansas-Nebraska bill, Abraham Lincoln told his audience that we had gone to bed dreaming that Missouri would give up slavery, and woke up in the morning to find out that slavery had been pushed into the Nebraska territory.